If you ever stop and think about it, it really is astounding just the sheer amount of shows that have been broadcast on television. There's just been so many different ones made, and all of them are so wholly unique to themselves. Some of them are great, some of them are bad, and some of them sound so insane when you try to explain the premise out loud, you begin to question yourself, is this a real show or did I make it up? Until you remember that no, The Secret Diary of Desmond Pfeiffer was very real. But even though every show is unique or batshit crazy in its own way, if a show runs long enough, they will usually find themselves falling into a familiar trope. You know what I'm talking about. Those types of episodes that every show seems to do. Most people are already familiar with the very special episode or the bottle episode, but there's also the amnesia episode, the vacation episode, the musical episode, and if you're a show in the early to mid 90s, the inexplicable Little Richard cameo episode. But of all of them, my personal favorite has always been the pro wrestling episode. As a lifelong wrestling fan, it was always so exciting whenever a show I liked figured out some convoluted way to get their characters in the squared circle. And those episodes of TV are some of my favorites. A shocking amount of shows had a wrestling episode. And while most of them were sitcoms, a surprising amount of drama series also crossed over with the Sport of Kings. Still, despite being one of the more popular television tropes, there have only been a handful of attempts to set a live-action series in the colorful world of pro wrestling. And most of them weren't until the past few years. But way back in 1988, someone had to be the first to try. And long before Zoya the Destroyer, the Crybaby, or Young Rock, there was the first pro wrestling sitcom star, the Masked Maniac, in his syndicated sitcom classic, Learning the Ropes.
In this world of ours, sometimes bring us down, pin our hopes to the ground, but we can work it out. 'Cause giving in is oh so hard, but love is at stake. Where there's a will, there's a way. Now if we only knew how, learning the ropes, learning to laugh and fears, learning to fight through these years that bring us closer together. Learning the ropes, learning the first golden rule, knowing that anything is possible. 'Cause nothing's gonna keep us from learning the ropes.
The 1980s would see professional wrestling gain the most mainstream popularity it had probably seen since the days of Gorgeous George. And the ratings they were drawing were so high that people in the TV industry were beginning to take notice. Among those who took an interest in the high ratings were producers at Robert Halmi Incorporated, who saw the numbers that pro wrestling was bringing in and thought they could capitalize on that popularity by creating a series that revolved around pro wrestling. It's unclear who had the initial idea for the concept, but the creation of the show is largely attributed to a writer and producer named Edward Self, who had a long working relationship with Robert Halmi Sr. Hey, it's entirely possible someone else was the creative force behind the show, but believe it or not, there aren't a lot of people rushing to take credit for learning the ropes, so I have to try and piece together what I can. What is not in question is the premise of the show, as Learning the Ropes tells the tale of Robert Randall, who tries to balance his job as a private school teacher with his role as a single father, all while secretly moonlighting as a masked pro wrestler to make some extra money. What would set Learning the Ropes apart was that it would feature actual pro wrestlers, and not only that, but pro wrestlers from the National Wrestling Alliance. The NWA was the biggest competitor to the World Wrestling Federation, and even though the NWA product was in many ways superior to the WWF's, the WWF was always far better at garnering mainstream attention. Whenever a wrestler appeared on a TV show, it was almost always going to be a WWF superstar. It was so uncommon for the NWA wrestlers to appear on television shows that all the examples I'm showing here are from the early to mid 90s, because in 1989, it was just not something that ever happened. So the NWA and its president, Jim Crockett, saw a unique opportunity to try and bring their promotion closer to the mainstream, and agreed to provide their wrestlers for the program. Few knew it at the time, but the NWA was in perilous financial shape. And so it's no surprise to find out that according to the wrestling newsletter Matwatch, Crockett also purchased a 20% interest in the program, probably hoping for a big enough success that it could dig them out of the hole they were in. Likely given their history of filming in the area, Robert Halmi Inc. chose to film the show in Toronto, Canada, and the show was scheduled to air on a Canadian channel named CTV. With that, the casting process began, which consisted mostly of relatively unknown Canadian actors. At least I think they're relatively unknown, I'm from America, so unless they were on an episode of The Red Green Show, I'm not gonna recognize them. In the major roles, you had Cheryl Wilson as Robert's friend / co-worker / unrequited love interest who just won't take no for an answer, Carol. Budding heartthrob Yannick Bisson as Robert's mischievous son, Mark. And Nicole Stoffman as Robert's straight-laced daughter, Ellen. Of all the cast members, I think Nicole was the biggest star, as she left her role as Stephanie K on Degrassi to join the show in an attempt to elevate her career. Much like Star Trek, when it comes to Degrassi, I am strictly a Next Generation guy, so I can't speak to how good she was on the show, but based on my research, it seems I am legally obligated to reference the time she won an election after promising to kiss any boy who voted for her in her campaign slogan, "All the way with Stephanie K." But the biggest role in the show went to the biggest star, as American football player Lyle Alzado would play the lead role of Robert Randall. A multiple-time Pro Bowler and former Defensive Player of the Year, Alzado was a menace on the gridiron who loved the violence of football. Hell, the NFL created the Lyle Alzado rule after he ripped off someone's helmet and tried to hurt them with it. Off the field, though, Alzado was an incredibly charming and thoughtful man, although he was still kinda crazy. This is a guy who decided the best way to gain leverage in contract negotiations with the Denver Broncos was to stage an exhibition fight with Muhammad Ali a few weeks before training camp. An exhibition fight that got kinda real. After his time in Denver, he spent 2 years with the Cleveland Browns before he joined the Los Angeles Raiders, where he not only finally won a Super Bowl ring, but began pursuing an acting career. The 80s would see Alzado appear frequently in a variety of movies and TV shows, and he seemed to take it pretty serious. He wasn't doing Mammoth or anything, but he didn't want to just play meatheads. He wanted to give this acting thing a real try, and learning the ropes was a perfect chance for him to try and stretch his range. The show's pilot, Unmasking the Masked Maniac, sets the stage for the premise of the series. After his wife leaves him to study law in England, Robert Randall is forced to become a single father to his kids Mark and Ellen. Although he has a job as a teacher at the same private school his children attend, Robert still needs to save money for their college education, so he begins moonlighting as a pro wrestler named the Masked Maniac. Knowing he will lose his job if the principal or fellow teachers, especially his friend Carol, who is overwhelmingly infatuated with him, find out about his secret life, he keeps it from everyone except for a few of his fellow wrestlers. That is, until his son discovers the Masked Maniac mask in the closet, prompting Robert to come clean to his children about his wrestling career and why he's doing it, before the episode ends with all of them agreeing to keep it secret together. At least that's how that pilot ends, as there were 4 different pilots filmed. You see, while the show was going to air in Canada on CTV, in America, the show is going to go into syndication. Syndication at that time meant that representatives from media markets all over the country would travel to the National Association of Television Programming Executives convention every year looking for new programming. In order to try and maximize their chances, the team behind the syndication effort, Producers Group International, made multiple pilots in an attempt to convince more networks to buy their show, which, while creating some questionable continuity issues we'll talk about later on, actually worked, as Learning the Ropes was syndicated in basically all the top media markets in the US. But before it aired in the US, it would first make its debut in Canada on September 16, 1988, as part of CTV's Friday night lineup, alongside a pair of other new shows, Cats and Dog, and a show with one of the best theme songs of all time.
You'll never guess my secret identity.
The show began airing in the US in October, and the initial ratings were solid, especially among kids. The reviews for the show weren't great, but the only review that matters here is mine, and I gotta say, I think Learning the Ropes sucks, but in a way I really enjoy. Make no mistake, the show is a cheesy 80s sitcom complete with all the tropes, so it isn't surprising to find out that the creative team behind the show, Neil Rosen and George Tricker, cut their teeth working on programs like Welcome Back Kotter and Too Close for Comfort. It's your standard family sitcom where misunderstandings lead to hijinks, lead to life lessons. Alzado isn't the best actor, but he does as well as he can with the material he's given. I actually think everyone on the show does a good enough job, although I really can't stand the Mark character. But that's probably because it's giving off some real, but we got Mike Seaver at home energy. Quite frankly, if this was a regular sitcom, I wouldn't be doing this episode. But what makes the show so enjoyable to talk about for me is the wrestling element. In Learning the Ropes, pro wrestling is real, and the Masked Maniac is not good at it. Now, this was before wrestling companies went around admitting it was fake.
Wrestling's not fake!
Admitting it was scripted.
It's still real to me, damn it!
Admitting it wasn't on the up and up.
I'll allow it.
So in the show, the wrestling is real, but the guys all get along outside of the ring and talk about how they'll definitely not lose to them next time. Some people, like former NWA manager Jim Cornette, would criticize the show for making wrestling look fake. But I don't know, man. I think the idea of the wrestlers as co-workers not holding grudges after competing with each other makes much more sense than, this.
Let me tell you something. Eddie Marlin, the old fossil that used to do your promoting here, he used to book he had this creature feature where he had Jason, Freddy, the Undertaker, the Zombie. Well, when you look for monsters and people from the Lost Lagoon, you pick the original monsters. And I'm not talking about your wife and your mother-in-law. I want you idiots to take a good look at the Wolfman and Frankenstein. Roll that monitor.
Well, there they are, Wolfman and Frankenstein.
In the world of wrestling, I won't say that the show is controversial, but people definitely have strong opinions about it. Cornette and former NWA announcer Tony Schiavone are on record saying the show wasn't very good, while their former broadcast partner Jim Ross and another NWA manager named J.J. Dillon liked how the show humanized pro wrestlers. Dillon actually appeared on an episode of Learning the Ropes, replayed a wrestler who was secretly an artist, which came in handy when Robert used his art to get out of a jam with his girlfriend Carol. Now, if you're wondering why Robert is dating Carol when I mentioned earlier that her entire character motivation was to be hopelessly in love with him despite his total lack of interest, well, your guess is as good as mine. I can only assume that maybe it's because that was one of those initial 4 pilots that were shown to prospective buyers, but I have no way of knowing. Of the 26 episodes that were apparently filmed, only 18 of them are available, so it's hard to tell if that's a continuity error or if this show had actual plot development. It's a shame we don't have those missing episodes, but luckily thanks to old TV listings, we can sit and wonder what it would have been like to watch episodes where Robert falls for the daughter of wrestler Paul Jones, where Mark gets electrocuted, where Ellen's boyfriend is a drug addict, or the one I'm actually very bummed isn't out there, an episode where Robert tangles with a rich wrestler who decides to demolish Ridgedale High to make way for a condo complex. I spent a long time trying to figure out who that wrestler could be, but much like the Masked Maniac, even though there isn't footage of the guy who tried to tear down the high school, there's still plenty of footage of other wrestlers who appeared on the show, as almost every week someone from the NWA would appear on the show in some capacity. They would either appear in a match against the Masked Maniac, in the locker room set with Robert, or if they were lucky, they would actually end up factoring into the main plot. The matches that were shown on Learning the Ropes were filmed months earlier, during the tapings for NWA's weekly TV shows. While a great athlete, Alzado did not wrestle as the Masked Maniac. That honor actually went to several people. The first was Dr. Death Steve Williams, who grew up idolizing Alzado and claimed in his book that Alzado personally selected him. Dr. Death's excitement probably faded when during his first match as the Maniac against Ric Flair, he injured his knee. When he came back later on for a match against Tully Blanchard, he got hurt again, forcing Arn Anderson to take over the role for the rest of that night. And to make matters even worse, even Arn got hurt playing the Maniac. After that, the character would be portrayed in the rest of the series by a wrestler far lower down the card named the Italian Stallion. He didn't just play the Maniac on the show, as you can find records of him wrestling in the North Carolina independent scene throughout the 90s as the Masked Maniac gimmick. It made sense to have someone lower on the card play the Maniac, as he essentially just got his ass kicked. There aren't many instances of the Maniac winning, and in fact a wrestler named Tim Horner quit the NWA entirely when he found out that they wanted to tape him losing a match to the Maniac. The only person the Maniac beats in any episode I saw was Ron Simmons, which if you know anything about how deeply racist the NWA was, it's real hard not to side-eye the fuck out of that. While a few wrestlers appeared only in the matches, a lot of them actually flew to CTFO studios in Toronto and filmed scenes. Most of them were extended cameos, and it's where you'd see the likes of Stan Lane, Ric Flair, and Ron Garvin really show off their acting chops.
Here's that book you gave me on the French Revolution. I found it interesting. When people are oppressed and destitute, they're able to bind together to create constructive change. The human spirit rises to meet any challenge it needs to survive.
But the highlights of the show were the handful of episodes where the wrestlers factor heavily into the story. There's an episode where Robert puts gorgeous Jimmy Garvin in the hospital for real and has to deal with his guilt. There's an episode where the Road Warriors show up to a party at Robert's house and Carol attempts to date the both of them to make Robert jealous. There's another episode with the Road Warriors where they come to a career day at the school to speak to the kids, but when they meet Robert, they don't know him, even though they've been to a party at his house, so I'm guessing that's the third pilot. And then there's the infamous Ricky Morton episode. Thanks to WrestleCrap.com, this is probably the most famous episode of the show, as it sees the Rock and Roll Express's Ricky Morton form a band with Mark against Robert's wishes. Their performance goes so well that Mark's dreams of rock stardom turn him into a jerk, but when Ricky leaves the band, he's humbled and left with a valuable life lesson.
But the magic just wasn't there without Ricky Morton.
But the best of not only the wrestling episodes, but the series entirely, stars Captain Redneck Dick Murdoch. In the episode, after taking some advice from Robert, Murdoch's wife throws him out, prompting him to move in with the Randall family and drive them crazy with his redneck ways. It's a cliche sitcom premise, but you know what? Dick Murdoch is actually really funny, and I think it's an actual good episode with some funny moments. Especially when the Randall family try to get him to embrace his softer side by giving him a pet, leading to this memorable promo.
Tonight we're talking to the meanest, nastiest, gnarliest man in professional wrestling, Redneck Dick Murdoch.
Ah, coochie.
What's that? A new instrument of torture?
It's Blanche.
Oh, she's precious.
She's not precious. She's Blanche.
Actually, she's got nicer legs than precious, and more of them. So what happened to the mean image, Redneck?
I'm tender now.
You weren't tender in the ring with the masked maniac.
That's because I promised Blanche and myself that we'd go for a walk on her treadmill.
You really love that little thing. Better make sure nobody steps on it.
If someone steps on Blanche, it'll be their last step.
Despite that incredible performance from Murdoch, Learning the Ropes ratings slowly declined. Although initially reported as being picked up for a second season, the CTV canceled the series, with programming vice president Arthur Weinthal telling the Ottawa Citizen, "It was doing okay for us, but I don't particularly like okay, and I didn't particularly like the show." The show proved to also not be the success for the NWA that Jim Crockett had hoped for. Not that it probably would have mattered, as by the end of 1988, they had officially sold to Ted Turner, paving the way for the launch of World Championship Wrestling. Robert Halmi Inc. continued their prolific output, which would make countless TV specials and win numerous awards, including the 1990 Emmy for Outstanding Drama and Comedy Special for a TV film titled The Incident, an honor they shared with Learning the Ropes creator, Edwin Self. As for the cast of the show, most of them continued working in films and television, but it was actually Yannick Bisson who had come out of the show as the biggest star, as his show Murdoch Mysteries has run on Canadian television for 20 years. Oh, and Murdoch Mysteries did do a wrestling episode. Unfortunately for Lyle Alzado, there would be no chance for him for a long-running series, as his time after the show was marred by tragedy. He attempted to make a comeback to the NFL at age 41, but was unable to return to the sport he loved. Shortly after that, he was diagnosed with a brain tumor, which he attributed to decades of steroid abuse. In the last years of his life, he went public with his use of performance-enhancing drugs and implored anyone who would listen to heed his cautionary tale. He sadly passed away at age 43. In interviews over the years, all the cast members of the show have remembered him fondly, referring to him as a gentle giant and a pleasure to work with. To some, he'll always be a Bronco, to others, he'll always be a Raider, but to the ones who know, he'll always be the masked maniac. Hey, thanks for watching. If you like the video, hit the like button. If you want to see more of my stuff, hit subscribe. And let me know in the comments what you think of Learning the Ropes. I'm curious. Thanks.